Okay, we're going to look at the second part of H is for Hawk, so make sure you've got it in your blue anthology, and it's on page 20. And we're going to start from line 32. So if you haven't looked at the first part of this yet, then have a look at part 1, and make sure you've got some notes on that bit, and then we're starting from line 32. Through all this, the man was perfectly calm. He gathered up the hawk in one practiced movement, folding her wings, anchoring her broad feathered back against his chest, gripping her scaled yellow legs in one hand. "Let's get that hook back on," he said tautly. There was concern in his face. It was born of care. This hawk had been hatched in an incubator, had broken from a frail bluish eggshell into a humid perspex box, and for the first few days of her life this man had fed her with scraps of meat held in a pair of tweezers, waiting patiently for the lump and fluffy chick to notice the food and eat, her new neck wobbling with the effort of keeping her head in the air. All at once, I loved this man, and fiercely. I grabbed the hood from the box and turned to the hawk. Her beak was open, her hackles raised, her wild eyes were the colour of sun on white paper, and they stared because the whole world had fallen into them at once. 1, 2, 3. I tucked the hood over her head. There was a brief intimation of a thin, angular skull under her feathers, of an alien brain fizzing and fusing with terror. Then I drew the braces closed. We checked the ring numbers against the form. It was the wrong bird. This was the younger one, the smaller one. This was not my hawk. Oh. Okay, a few things to pick out from that bit so far, so make sure you've got a pen and you're writing a few things down. The first thing I would say is that the previous paragraph has been really tense, hasn't it? One of the things that actually makes it really tense is the fact that she uses the present tense in the previous paragraph, doesn't she? So for instance, on line 20 it says, "My heart jumps sideways." And one of the reasons why the present tense is used in that previous paragraph, remember, is that it engages you and creates that sense of immediacy, doesn't it? It makes you feel as if you're there in that moment. And so anything that is described as tense is all the more tense as a result of that, isn't it? I think at the beginning of this paragraph, so on line 32, look at that first line. There's a bit of a contrast, isn't there? Because it says, "Through all this, the man was perfectly calm." And I think you've got that adverb, perfectly, and then the adjective, calm, haven't you? There's such a contrast between him and his responses, at least, and the way that she feels about the whole thing. She's getting quite stressed about it because the hawk is so powerful and she's meeting the hawk for the first time, and everything's very tense, isn't there? All these short sentences for impact help to create that too, don't they? But he, because he's experienced, because he knows what he's doing, because he's professional and so on, he's got this very calm, professional demeanour. So there's a real contrast between him and, or at least his behaviour, and what might be happening internally, or certainly how she's responding to the whole thing. So you could pick up that sense of contrast there, couldn't you? I think it's worth picking up on line 35, where it says, "There was concern in his face." He wants to get the hawk back into the box, doesn't he? Or put the hood back on, rather. And he's worried because he's worried about how the hawk might react to suddenly being out in the open and everything. And it says, "There was concern in his face. It was born of care." And I would just pick out those words concern and care, partly because you can make just an easy little language point about them, because they're called abstract nouns. So an abstract noun, remember, is like an idea or a concept, an emotion. It's like a thing, but not a physical thing. It's like a conceptual thing, okay? And so concern and care are abstract nouns. So you could say the writer uses the abstract nouns concern and care in order to I suppose, highlight the man's calmness and his authority and his professionalism, and I suppose also how nurturing he is, because that's what this second part of the paragraph then moves on to talk about, isn't it? It's his role as a nurturer, and that's what really seems to strike Helen Macdonald, doesn't she, when she's in his presence, because she then goes on to talk about how the man had fed the chick from when it had first hatched. She says things like, "For the first few days of her life, this man had fed her with scraps of meat held in a pair of tweezers, waiting patiently," look at that adverb again, patiently, "for the lump and fluffy chick to notice the food and eat, her new neck wobbling with the effort of keeping her head in the air. The vulnerability of the chick is emphasised, isn't it, with images like her new neck wobbling with the effort of keeping her head in the air. And the man is kind of like portrayed as this really nurturing, caring, tender, patient, loving father that's gently holding the tweezers and waiting for the chick to respond. And then you get quite a shocking, in a way, little sentence where she says, all at once I loved this man, and fiercely. Notice the adverb fiercely there. And you kind of think, why? What's going on here? And you obviously have to look at the context in order to make sense of this. So if you look at the black bit at the top in bold, it says that her father died recently of a heart attack and she was devastated. And so she adopted this goshawk to distract her from her grief. So the context of the fact is the fact that she's lost her father recently. So she's still in this grieving process, isn't she? And so when she then encounters this man who is acting like this tender, loving, nurturing father, in a way he almost becomes a kind of substitute father. It's like as if, you know, the very thing that she's grieving, that she's missing, she's there in the presence of that person, isn't she, almost? And so that's why she reacts in a way that at first sight might seem quite extreme, might seem quite irrational, quite absurd even, but it's because of the context of what she's going through in terms of the grieving process at that moment. So I think you have to pick that sentence out and explain how you might first read that as a reader, but then show how once you're aware of the context, you're able to place what otherwise might be perceived to be irrational, extreme behaviour within that context, and it makes sense. The paragraph moves on, and we then realise in the next paragraph, really short paragraph, beginning line 46, we realise it was the wrong bird, don't we? And there are loads of short sentences in this extract as a whole, aren't there? But we get quite a few here. We get 4 in a row. It was the wrong bird. This was the younger one, the smaller one. This was not my hawk. So 4 really short sentences in a row. The first 2 and the fourth are short, simple sentences. The third one is even a minor sentence, isn't it? The smaller one. So a minor sentence, remember, is a sentence that shouldn't really be one because it hasn't even got a verb in it. Okay, but they're all really short sentences to emphasise what they're, to create that sense of shock, I suppose, isn't it? The next paragraph then is just a single word paragraph. I mean, so it's just like a single word exclamative, oh, in italics, again to emphasise the shock, I suppose, at that point. Let's carry on from line 49. So we put her back and opened the other box, which was meant to hold the larger, older bird. And dear God, it did. Everything about this second hawk was different. She came out like a Victorian melodrama, a sort of madwoman in the attack. She was smokier and darker and much, much bigger. Notice the comparative adjectives there. So a comparative adjective, it either ends in er or it has more before it. So more beautiful, more trustworthy, bigger, newer, darker. Yeah. So here you've got smokier, darker, bigger. You've got 3 comparative adjectives in a row to show the contrast between this hawk and the other one. Sorry, let's carry on. She was smokier and darker and much, much bigger, and instead of twittering, she wailed, great awful gouts of sound like a thing in pain. And the sound was unbearable. This is my hawk, I was telling myself, and all I could do was, it was all I could do to breathe. She too was bareheaded, and I grabbed the hood from the box as before, and as I brought it up to her face, I looked into her eyes and saw something blank and crazy in her stare, some madness from a distant country. I didn't recognise her. This isn't my hawk. The hood was on, the ring numbers checked, the bird back in the box, the yellow form folded, the money exchanged, and all I could think was, but this isn't my hawk. Slow panic. I knew what I had to say, and it was a monstrous breach of etiquette. This is really awkward, I began, but I really liked the first one. Do you think there's any chance I could take that one instead? I tailed off. His eyebrows were raised. I started again, saying stupider things. I'm sure the other falconer would like the larger bird. She's more beautiful than the first one, isn't she? I know this is out of order, but would it be all right, you think? and on, a desperate, crazy barrage of incoherent appeals. I'm sure nothing I said persuaded him more than the look on my face as I said it. A tall, white-faced woman with wind-wrecked hair and exhausted eyes was pleading with him on a quayside, hands held out, as if she were in a seaside production of Medea. Looking at me, he must have sensed that my stuttered request wasn't a simple one, that there was something behind it that was very important. There was a moment of total silence. I suppose, well, what could be behind it? Could it be this idea that it's a younger hawk, and so somehow, she's lost this father-daughter relationship, hasn't she? The part of the reason why she's getting the hawk is because she's going through this grieving process. Is somehow, although it's like a reversal of roles, is she wanting to create a new kind of parent-child relationship, where this time she's the parent and the hawk is the child, and so to her it makes much more sense to have, on some sort of subconscious level, to have this younger hawk, this one that she can tend for and care for and raise and so on. So is that what's behind it? It could be, couldn't it? Let's just go back and look at a few other things though. There are a couple of references here that you might not be familiar with. So one is where it says on line 51, it says a sort of mad woman in the attack. Now that's meant to be a little bit of wordplay, a little bit of play on words there. It's meant to sound like a mad woman in the attic. And it's particularly a reference to Jane Eyre, which is a novel by Charlotte Bronte. And if you've read it, you'll kind of know the reference here. But if you don't, there's a character called Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre who has his first wife, called Bertha. He keeps her up in the attic because she's insane, and so she exhibits quite extreme behaviour. And so, for instance, it talks about her laughter being demonic, and she makes lots of sort of snarling, grunting noises, and there are all these sounds from the attic. At times, he tries to keep her locked up and tries to keep her sort of away from other people, but at times Jane and others kind of hear these sounds. And eventually we realise what the sounds are, and it's this mad woman up in the attic, basically. And so I think it's partly to do with the idea of being like a sort of quite horrific, unpredictable figure that's arousing lots of fear. So it could be partly to do with that. But it's also to do with the sounds, I think. So when it says she was smokier and darker and much bigger, and instead of twittering, she wailed. Look at that verb, wailed. Great awful gouts of sound, like a thing in pain, and the sound was unbearable. And I think those sounds are meant to sound like the sort of demonic, insane grunting and snarling and laughter of Bertha up in the attic. That's the kind of the intertextual link or allusion that Helen Macdonald is making there. And it's also quite a lot of sensory description, isn't it? So again, it kind of involves you as a reader because you can hear these horrific, grotesque sounds, and it kind of elicits this sense of fear, doesn't it? We get these bits where you can see the development of her thought processes, can't you? Where she's trying to convince herself to start with, and she says, "This is my hawk," in italics, and then that's on line 54, and then on line 57 you get, "This isn't my hawk." And then it becomes stronger, doesn't it, on line 59, where it says, "But this isn't my hawk." You can see her thought processes where she's trying to convince herself and then realises she's not going to be able to, and starts to want to sort of, defy, convention and etiquette, and actually sort of protest against this and try to reverse the process and the decision because she wants the original one, doesn't she? But these bits in italics, basically they're in italics because they're her thoughts. And so it's a way of us tapping into exactly what she was thinking at that moment. These short little bursts of thought that really tap into exactly how she was responding to the moment at the time, I suppose. She then goes on to, you get quite a lot of questions then, don't you? How many questions are there from lines sort of 60 to 65? It's just question after question after question, isn't it? If you want the posh term for that, you can call them interrogatives. But what does it show? That's the important thing. You've got to not just say, look, there are lots of questions, but explain what the effect of that is. Well, it shows her desperation. Look at what she says. Do you think there's any chance? I'm sure the other falconer would like the other larger bird. She's more beautiful than the other one, isn't she? You know, would it be all right, do you think? She's pleading, isn't she? You can see the desperation in her voice through the question after question after question. And if you pick out the fact that repeated use of questions, you're actually picking out something about sentence types, which is something that, again, a lot of candidates won't necessarily talk about. Then you get this comic image, don't you, of her, this white-faced woman with wind-wrecked hair and exhausted eyes, as if you're in a seaside production of Medea. So it's kind of like this really extreme comic image of her looking slightly mad. It's meant to be kind of self-deprecatory humour there, isn't it? She's recognising, looking back on it, how ridiculous and maybe sort of slightly scary she must have looked. And then right at the end, we don't actually know what's going to happen, do we? Because the extract ends with, there was a moment of total silence. Now, remember, this is an extract from a much longer text, isn't it? So we don't exactly know. Just looking at my bookshelves because I've got it here somewhere. But within this extract, we don't actually know what happens. And so if you're writing about this in the exam, you need to say that it ends, for the purposes of this extract, it ends on a cliffhanger. So we would need to read on to find out. But that in itself creates a degree of suspense, doesn't it? Because we're kind of thinking, what's he going to say? Is he going to allow her to take the younger one? So in terms of the ending of the text, that could be a useful thing for you to pick up on and to talk about structurally. And when you're answering question 5, that could also be a useful thing potentially to talk about when you're comparing the one from the anthology with the unseen one, because maybe you could look at the endings of both. That could be a good comparative paragraph, couldn't it? How do they both end? Do they both end on cliffhangers? Do they both, what about in terms of tone or mood or atmosphere? Do they end on a note of tension? Or is there a sense of relief or resolution at the end? So, but talking about the endings of texts could be a useful thing to look at for your question 5. Okay, if you found that useful, then please like it and share it and subscribe to English Gorillas.